When the militia attacked Jean's village, everything changed.
They
came at night. They caught me and took me away. We arrived at the militia camp in daylight. I didn't know how to get back home. I was afraid because I was still a child.
How old, we ask?
I was 9.
At 9, he had become a soldier. Jean is not his real name. We were asked to protect his identity. Before long, he says, life in the brutal FDLR militia became almost normal.
They used to assign jobs to us. If they assign you to cook, then you cook. Or if it is time to look for food, then you look for food. Or if it is time to fight, then you fight.
When he got old enough to carry a gun, commanders taught him how to use it.
We used to live a life of war. Sometimes we were attacked and ran away, and we would come back and just fight and fight. Sometimes we would attack. That is how my life used to be.
Each time Jean tried to escape, he says, they caught him and beat him mercilessly. 3 weeks ago, he succeeded, sneaking to a UN military base before dawn. It had been 6 years. Now he's at a transition center for former child soldiers.
The way they're treated, they lose their humanity.
The center director says many of the boys were given alcohol and drugs to get them to fight.
The place for the children is in the family and the school. When you use a child less than 18 years, they're like a robot. If you tell them execute or kill, they will do that because they don't have any military discipline.
The boys here fought on different sides of Congo's brutal conflict. Now they're learning to play together and dance together, recapturing a little of their innocence. More than 30,000 child soldiers have gone through centers like this one. Jean says he hasn't made any friends yet, but it's still better than the beatings and patrols.
I just want to live well and stay with my parents so that I can go back to school so I can get a better life.
He's learned the life of a soldier. Now he hopes to regain the life of a child.
Imperialism, which today is waging war against a genuine struggle for human liberation, sowed seeds of decay here and there that must be mercilessly rooted out from our land and from our minds. We shall deal here with the problem of mental disorders born out of the natural war of liberation waged by the Algerian people. And the clip was an example, but I will also tie this into PTSS for Black people in America. Perhaps the reader will find these notes on psychiatry out of place or ultimately in a book like this. There's absolutely nothing we can do about that. We had no control over the fact that the psychiatric phenomena, the mental and behavioral disorders emerging from the war, have loomed so large among the preceptors and pacification and the pacified population. The truth is that colonization in its very essence already appeared to be a great purveyor of psychiatric hospitals. Since 1954, we have drawn the attention of French and international psychiatrists and scientific works to the difficulty of curing a colonized subject correctly. In other words, making him thoroughly fit into a social environment of the colonial type. In other words, making him fit thoroughly into a social environment of the colonial type. Because it is a systemized negation of the other, a frenzied determination to deny the other any attribute of humanity, colonialism forces the colonized to constantly ask the question, who am I really? Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back. Happy Monday. Welcome back to On the Shoulders of Giants. I am Joseph Ward, continuing my reading of Frantz Fanon's book, The Wretched of the Earth. And I'm picking up on the chapter, War and Mental Disorders, starting on page 181. This chapter goes along with this clip. This was a great clip that I found of the young man giving this experience of being a child soldier, but also talking about the mental disorders or the mental weight it the mental weight that he had upon himself, what happened to him mentally? PTSD. PTSD and a host of other things that come from witnessing all of the death and being a child soldier himself. So we're linking that to what we're reading here in Frantz Fanon's book, but we're also linking that to what Black Americans experience here in America that caused us the PTSD, the epigenetics of our trauma, right? So all of these things are being linked together. So yes, Dr. Joy DeGruy, her book PTSS, I'll put that in the description. If you don't have it, you should have it. If you watch this channel, you should have her book. But if you don't, I'll put that book link in the description. So therefore, we can link these things together, right? Because it all goes together. But Frantz Fanon is talking about what happened to Africans being colonized on the continent. But we're also linking that to, we're looking at the overall behavior of the colonizer, i.e. white supremacist, and looking at the psychological effects that they had on the Black people, the traumatic effects that war and violence have had on Black people. So we're going to read some, I'm going to do some reading, but this chapter is a bit different because this chapter is filled with case studies. So I have about 3 case studies that I'll read from different sections. So there are different, let me find it. Look at this case study number 2. So there are different sections in this book that give case studies under specific topics. And so under specific series, I just need to find it. So under specific series, there's series A, B, C, D, E. So under these specific series, they're case numbers. And so I'm going to read a case for each series so we can get a good understanding of how war and violence have caused the mental disorders or the setbacks in the lives of the people who were victims of these violence, but also linking that to what we experience here in America, the violence that we've experienced here in America and the environments that are violent and how it has contributed to our PTSS. So let's continue. Page 182, second paragraph. The defensive positions born out of this violent confrontation between the colonized and the colonial constitute a structure which then reveals the colonized personality. In order to understand this sensibility, we need only to study and appreciate the scope and depth of the wounds inflicted on the colonized during a single day under colonial regime. We must remember in any case that a colonized people is not just a dominated people. Under the German occupation, the French remained human beings. Under the French occupation, the Germans remained human beings. In Algeria, there is not simply domination, but the decision literally to occupy nothing but a territory. The Algerians, the women dressed in hikes and palm groves, the palm groves and the camels from a landscape, the natural backdrop for the French presence. A hostile, ungovernable, and fundamentally religious nature is in fact synonymous in the colonies with the bush, the mosquitoes, the natives, the disease. Colonization has succeeded once this untamed nature is brought under control. Cutting railroads through the bush, draining swamps, and ignoring the political and economic existence of the native people are in fact one and the same thing. When colonization remains unchallenged by armed resistance, when the sum of harmful stimulants exceed a certain threshold, the colonized defenses collapse, and many of them end up in psychiatric institutions. In the calm of this period of triumphant colonization, a constant and considerable stream of mental symptoms are direct sequels of this oppression. Today, the all-out national war of liberation waged by the Algerian people for 7 years has become a breeding ground for mental disorders. So when I'm reading this, I'm thinking about what I see on a regular basis. I do a lot of community work here in Tallahassee, especially through my safe sex lane. Like I'm outside of being the Black History Man, I'm the safe sex man, right? Because I've already told y'all that my 2 fronts We're looking at the 9 areas of human activity where white supremacy dominates. My two fronts are sex and education, right? So when I'm out in the community, I often see our people, Black people, suffering from mental disorders, suffering from untreated mental disorders. And oftentimes, if I get a chance to talk to these people, because these are the people in the community that we're serving, right? So when I get a chance to talk to these people, and if they're in the best state of their right mind that they can be when we're having a conversation, they're giving me information about what factors led to their mental state being what it is. And of course, a part of this conversation is to link them to care, link them to mental health care so we can help improve their mental health. But a lot of their mental health issues have come from come from the circumstances, come from their environments, come from what they've seen, what they've witnessed, what they've experienced. Violence, trauma, poverty, low self-esteem, all of these things, they weigh down on our people. Post-traumatic slave syndrome. And we're already carrying the epigenetic history, the epigenetic trauma of America, of these 400 or 500 years that we've been in America. And the real trauma, the root trauma has never been treated. So yes, some of us as individuals, you'll go to therapy like you should, and your individual trauma is healed, but our collective trauma has yet to be addressed as a nation, as a people. And I think you should continue to go and address your individual trauma. But at some point, we're all going to have to get together to address our collective trauma. And in not addressing this trauma, we see a lot of our people are mentally wounded. A lot of our people are afflicted. A lot of our people need help. They're crying out for help. And a lot of us are looking at them. A lot of people are afraid of them. A lot of people are unwilling to help them. They're the crazy people. They're the people who, well, we gotta back away from them. We can't really talk to them. We gotta get away from them. Like, those are the people who need help. Remember, Neely Fuller said we're helping those who need the most constructive help. So those are the people that we need to be helping. Those are the people that we need to be linking to resources. How are you a resource to the people within your community, right? But overall, looking at how trauma negatively affects a person's mind. So the young man in the clip was talking about actually being a part of war. So there are those of us who have seen violence by proxy, like myself. I've never been in a shootout, but I've been in the environment where the shootout was plenty of times, right? I've never seen someone actually shoot, but I've seen the aftermath of someone being, So I've seen violence by proxy. I've never been up close in the violence. I've never been up close in the war. That's a whole nother different experience. I don't want none of it. I ain't even gonna lie to you, I don't want none of it. But this is this young man giving his experience of being actually in the war as a child after witnessing his family being deleted. And then having to be a part of these wars himself and how it messed up his mental. Like he talked about, having the nightmares, having the flashbacks and all these things, probably dealing with insomnia, anxiety, depression, all these different things. So this is the stuff that we're getting into today. All right. So, so Franz Fanon goes on to say, another well-established notion that deserves, in our opinion, to be reevaluated is that these psychiatric reactions are relatively benign. Anniversary reactions, in other words, cases where the entire personality has been definitively dislocated, have, of course, been described, but always and as exceptional cases. We believe, on the contrary, that the pathological process tend, as a rule, to be frequently malignant. These disorders last for months, wage a massive attack on the ego, and almost invariably leave behind a vulnerability virtually visible to the naked eye. And all evidence the future of these patients is compromised. The following example will illustrate our standpoint. In a certain African country, independent for some years now, we've had the opportunity of treating a patriot and former resistance fighter. The man in his 30s would come back and ask us for advice and help, since he was being afflicted with insomnia together with anxiety attacks and obsession with suicide around a certain date in the year. The critical date corresponded to the day he had been ordered to place a bomb somewhere. 10 people had perished during the attack. This militant, who never for a moment had thought of recanting, fully realized the price he had to pay in his person for national independence. Such borderline cases pose the question of responsibility in the context of the revolution, but it also points to actual outcomes, actual effects that actually happen to people when people are placed in traumatic situations. And a lot of our people have been placed in traumatic situations. A lot of our people have been placed in situations that have altered our mental state, whether drastically or even just a little bit. And we're not the same, but we don't even know where to start to get help because we didn't even know something happened to us. And that's one of the biggest issues. So we're starting with series A. I'm picking, so each series has a number of cases. I'm gonna pick one case out of the series. So with this is case number 1. It's the impotence in an Algerian following the rape of his wife. So the gentleman's name, they're going to say his name was B. So B is a 26-year-old man. He has been referred to us by the medical services of the National Liberation Front for the persistent migraines and insomnia. A former taxi driver, he has been a militant in the Nationalist Party since the age of 13. In 1955, he became a member of the FLN, and the FLN is the Front de Liberation Nationale. So on several occasions, he used his taxi to carry propaganda leaflets and political leaders. Confronted with a widening crackdown, the FLN decided to wage war in the urban centers. B was then assigned to driving commandos close to the point of attack and fairly often having to wait for them. One day, however, right in the middle of the European sector, following a fairly extensive commando raid, the sector was sealed off, forcing him to abandon his taxi and compelling the commando unit to break up and disperse. B, who managed to escape the enemy surveillance, took refuge at a friend's house, and a few days later, on orders from his superiors, went underground to join the nearest resistance unit without ever going home. For several months, he went without news of his wife and his 20-month-old daughter. He did learn, however, that the police had been looking for him for weeks in the city. After 2 years in the resistance movement, he received a message from his wife asking him to forget her. She had brought shame on his name. She had brought shame on herself. He must no longer think of coming back to live with her. Extremely worried, he requested permission from his commander to take a secret trip back home. It was refused. However, steps were taken for a member of the FLN to contact B's wife and parents. 2 weeks later, a detailed report reached the commander of B's unit. Now, this is the important part, right? Soon after, his abandoned taxi had been discovered, and they had 2 machine guns with magazines inside the taxi. A group of French soldiers and policemen had gone to B's home. Finding him absent, they took away his wife and kept her for over a week. She was interrogated about the company of her husband, she was interrogated about the company her husband kept, and fairly violently for 2 days. On the 3rd day, a French soldier was unable to say whether he was an officer ordered the others out, and raped her. Shortly afterward, a second soldier, this time in the presence of the others, once again raped her, telling her, if you ever see that bastard, your husband, again, don't you forget to tell him what we did to you. She remained another week without undergoing further interrogation. She was then escorted home. When she told her story to her mother, her mother, convinced her to tell her husband B. Soon as her husband got in touch with her again, she confessed her disgrace. Once the initial shock was over, B soon recovered by devoting every minute of his life to the cause. For several months, he took reports from Algerian women who had been tortured or raped. He had the opportunity of meeting with the husbands of abused women, and his personal misfortune, his dignity as an injured husband, took second place. That's going to get deep. This is going to get deep. In 1958, he was assigned to a mission abroad. Just before rejoining his unit, an unusual distraction and insomnia worried his comrades and his superiors. His departure was delayed and a medical examination ordered. This was when he was referred to us, and Frantz Fanon is saying referred to him. Our first impression was good, a lively face, a bit too lively perhaps. His smile was slightly forced, his exuberance superficial. I'm okay. I feel better now. Give me a fortifier, some vitamins, and let me go back. He was obviously anxious deep down. He was immediately hospitalized. On the second day, the smoke screen of optimism vanished, and we had on our hands a bedridden anorexic suffering from melancholic depression. He avoided any political discussion and manifested a marked disinterest for anything concerning the national struggle. He avoided listening to news about the War of Liberation. Identifying his problems was extremely laborious, but after several days, we managed to reconstruct his story. During his stay abroad, he had tried to have sexual intercourse but failed, thinking it was merely fatigue, normal after forced marches and periods of malnutrition. He again tried 2 weeks later and failed again. Spoke to a comrade about it who advised him to take vitamin B12. He took the tablet in form. He took it in tablet form. New attempt, new failure. Furthermore, a few months before the act, he had an irresistible impulse to tear up a photo of his little girl. A such symbolic connection could raise the possibility of unconscious and drives. However, several conversations and a dream in which the patient witnessed a rapid putrefying of a kitten giving off a nauseating smell led us in a completely new direction. The girl, he told us one day, referring to his daughter, had something rotten inside of her. From the moment on, his insomnia began extremely troubling, and despite a fairly large dose of neuroleptics, he developed a state of nervous anxiety that was particularly alarming. He then spoke to us for the first time about his wife and said laughingly, "She got a bit of French meat." It was then we were able to reconstruct the whole story. The fabric of events became clear. He told us that every time he tried to have sexual intercourse, he thought of his wife. What he confided to us seemed to be a fundamental interest. I married this girl whereas I was in love with my cousin, but the cousin's parents had arranged to marry their daughter to someone else. So I accepted the first girl my parents offered me. She was nice, but I didn't love her. I kept telling myself, you're young, wait a bit, and when you found the right girl, you'll divorce and make a happy marriage. I wasn't so very attracted to my wife. With the war, we moved even further apart. In the end, I used to come and eat my meals and go to bed with hardly a word between us. When I learned during my time with the freedom fighters, she had been raped by French soldiers, I first all felt angry with all the bastards. Then I said, oh, it's nothing serious. She wasn't eliminated. She could start her life again. And then several weeks it later dawned on me that she had been raped because they had been looking for me. In fact, she had been raped to punish her for keeping quiet. She could have easily given them at least one militant's name, which would have enabled them to discover and eliminate the network and perhaps even have me arrested. It was not therefore a simple grape for want of anything better to do out of evil. As I had often seen in the Darwars, it was a grape of a tenacious woman who was prepared to accept anything rather than give up her husband. And that husband was me. That woman had saved my life and had protected the network. It was my fault she had been dishonored. Yet she didn't say, "This is what I endured for you." On the contrary, she said, "Forget about me, start a new life. I had been disgraced." It was then I made up my mind to take her back after the war. I have to tell you, I've seen peasants dry the tears of their wives who had been raped under their very eyes. That shook me up quite a bit, and I have to confess that at first I couldn't understand their attitude. But we had to intervene increasingly in such circumstances to explain things to the civilian, and I have seen civilians volunteer to marry a young girl who had been raped and made pregnant by French soldiers. All that made me think again about my wife. I've made up my mind to take her back, but I still don't know how I'll react when I see her. And when I look at the picture of my daughter, I often think that she was dishonored as well, as if everything that had to do with my wife was rotten, as if they had tortured her, if they had broken her teeth and broken all of her teeth in her arm. I wouldn't have minded so much. But that thing, you can never get over it. And she did it, and she did. And did she have to tell me about it? He then asked me whether his sexual failing, in my opinion, was caused by his worrying. Answer is quite likely. He then sat up in bed. What would you do if it happened to you? I don't know. Would you take your wife back? I think I would. You see, you're not quite sure. He put his head in his hands and after a few moments left the room. From that day on, he gradually accepted to listen to political discussions while the migraines and anorexia lessened considerably. After 2 weeks, he rejoined his unit telling me, on independence, I'll take my wife back. If it doesn't work out, I'll come and see you again in Algiers. So this is one case from the first section, from the first group, from Series A. It's one case from Series A with Mr. B dealing with grief of what happened to his wife, which led to anxiety, anorexia, insomnia, and impotence. And him not knowing the root of it until he really got down to sit down and think about it and talk about it and really put everything on the table. Like having an inkling of what was causing it, but everything really coming to fruition, everything really coming to understanding when he can see that the trauma his wife experienced. Because now think about this. This goes back to what Dr. Joy DeGroot was talking about in PTSS, about how trauma affects people differently. So his wife was the victim of SA. His wife was the victim of SA because she didn't give up the information about where he was in the rebel group. And he felt guilty about that. So the guilt, but also the trauma that she felt started causing the mental disorders in him, which led to physical disorders in him. So he wasn't the actual person who was traumatized, but the effects of his wife's trauma weighed heavily on him. But also going back to, remember, he was the taxi driver, and sometimes being as the taxi driver driving the people in the liberation armies, he would find himself in peculiar situations of warfare. So all of these things being put together, our experiences matter. I remember being, we was in the projects here in Tallahassee. We was in the projects. I was with this group who was working on the after school program. In the middle of our meeting, all you hear is blam, 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 blam. I'm talking about sound like we had war. Sound like a whole war's outside. Like it's going off. Like I'm talking about all type of automatic rifles just busting off, just blam, 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 blam. And so it's just going off. So the crazy thing about it is that's when I really realized how desensitized we were. The group of people I was with. Because all we did was just stop and say, oh, they shooting again, and kept going. And just kept going on with our meeting like it was nothing, like it wasn't just no whole outside. Like for like a whole minute or 2 minutes, like you just didn't hear this, like just going off outside. And we shrugged our shoulders and just kept going. And so I did mention, I was like, hey man, y'all realize we desensitized because nobody hit the flow. Nobody panicked. Nobody was afraid. Nobody was like, oh my God, what's going on? Everybody was like, oh, they shooting again. That's not normal. To be desensitized to violence. And remember, this is not being actually in the trenches. This is violence by proxy. Because we're used to hearing this over and over and over again, but that's not normal. Something's wrong with that. But also, how does that affect us overall? I don't even know yet. I don't even know, because I know I'm desensitized a bit to violence because I know what I've seen. And there's been people who've seen 10 times worse than me. The young man in the clip, I can't even imagine what he's seen, but I know what I've seen. I know what I've witnessed. And so I don't even know how it has affected me. So we're talking about these mental disorders because once again, look at how we operate here in America as Black people. Our mentality is not healthy. Those chains of psychological slavery are being tightened on us. The trauma that we have experienced and continue to experience, it's a part of the oppression. It's the part of the domination. It's a part of the stick to keep us at this place to where they can stay in control. And we have to understand that. They have to keep us in a dependent place. They have to keep us in a desolate place. You take away their minds and you got them. These are all tactics that they're using to maintain control. Remember, we're reading about violent conflicts between groups of African people that were started by colonists. So this is series B. And so series B, so case number 2 in series B, paranoid delusions and suicidal behavior disguised as terrorist act in a young 21-year-old Algerian man. Okay. This patient was referred to the hospital by the French judiciary authorities following a medical and legal examination by French psychiatrists practicing in Algeria. The patient was emaciated and in a state of confusion. His body was covered in ecchymosis, and he was unable to absorb any food, owing to 2 fractures of the jaw. For over 2 weeks, the patient was fed intravenously. After 2 weeks, his thinking became less blank, and we were able to establish contact. We managed to reconstruct the young man's dramatic story. During adolescence, he had been an ardent scout and became one of the leaders in a Muslim scout movement. But at age 19, he completely abandoned the scouts to devote himself entirely to his profession. A passionate student of mechanical data processing, he dreamed of becoming a lead specialist in the field. November 1st, 1954, found him absorbed in strictly professional matters. At the time, he showed no interest in the national liberation struggle. He had already forsaken his former friends. He said he was at the time entirely devoted to improving his technical abilities. In mid-1955, however, during a family reunion, he suddenly got the impression his parents considered him a traitor. After a few days, this fleeting impression lost its edge, but deep down, he felt strangely anxious and uneasy. He declined, therefore, to spend a little time as possible eating and talking with his family and locked himself up in this room. Avoided any contact. It was under these circumstances that the catastrophe occurred. One day in the middle of the street, around 12:30, he distinctively heard a voice call him a traitor. He turned around but saw nobody. He hurried on and decided to stay away from work. He stayed in his room and did not have any dinner. It was during the night he suffered the attack. For 3 hours, he heard all kinds of insults, voices crying in his head, and in the darkness, traitor, coward, all your brothers are dying, traitor, traitor. He was gripped down by an indescribable anxiety. For 18 hours, my heart beat at 130 beats per minute. I thought I was going to die. From that moment on, the patient could no longer swallow a thing. He got thinner by the minute, kept himself in pitch darkness, and refused to see his parents. Around the third day, he isolated himself in prayer. He told me he remained kneeling 17 to 18 hours a day. On the fourth day, acting on impulse, like a madman with a beard, which must have made him look even more like a madman, went out without his usual jacket or tie. Once he stepped into the street, he had no idea where to go. But he walked and after a while found himself in the European sector. His physical appearance, he could be taken for a European, seems to have protected him from being stopped and questioned by the French police. Whereas next to him, Algerian men and women were being arrested, roughed up, insulted, and searched. Paradoxically, he had no identity papers on him. The fact that the enemy patrols instinctively showed him consideration confirmed the delusion that everyone knows he's on the side of the French. The soldiers themselves have orders to leave him alone. Moreover, the looks of the Algerians arrested with their hands behind their necks, waiting to be searched, seemed to him to be full of contempt. Stricken by an uncontrollable agitation, he quickly strolled away. It was then he found himself in front of the French staff headquarters. At the gate stood several soldiers armed with machine guns. He walked over towards the soldiers, hurled himself onto one of them, and tried to grab his machine gun, shouting, "I am an Algerian." Quickly brought under control, he was led into the police office, where they stubbornly tried to make him confess the names of the leaders and various members of the network for which he was supposedly working. After a few days, the police and soldiers realized that they were dealing with sick individuals, and an examination was ordered that concluded he was suffering from mental disorders and should be admitted to a hospital. All I wanted to do, he told us, was to die. Even at the police station, I believed, I hoped, and that after they tortured me, they would kill me. I was happy to be beaten because that proved they considered me to be one of the enemy as well. I couldn't go on hearing those accusations and do nothing. I'm not a coward. I'm not a sissy. I'm not a traitor. So this is a different experience with a different outcome, but same effects, same negative mental effects on the person's mind, because he wasn't actually involved in the conflicts. It was the idea of him being a traitor, the idea of his family and everybody around him seeing him as a Frenchman rather than an Algerian. You down with them white folk. It weighed on him mentally. But also, this is also the outcome of the colonial occupation, the colonial violence that they're dealing with on a regular basis. Remember, racism is the root of all of this now. The French are occupying this space. The French are terrorizing these people and being violent to these people. And so one of the many things that they have to hold on to is their solidarity, is them working as a unit, it's them being one. And if they see one of their people as helping the French, of course, they're going to look at him as being treasonous, right? And so But to him, it was taken to another level. To him, it affected his mental on a different level. It really negatively affected him, and it started to make him put himself in dangerous positions to prove his loyalty. Right? These are outcomes of people who are not healthy mentally. Now, I'm not claiming to be, and I'm not acting like I am a mental health professional. I've dabbled in learning about mental health. I'm a novelist. I do have a degree in psychology. But what I do understand is racism, white supremacy has really caused a lot of trauma. But the trauma is a part of the racism, white supremacy. The trauma is like the glue that helps everything else stick. So the more traumatized we can be, the less resistant we can be, the less effective we can be in our resistance. The more traumatized we are. The more traumatized we are, the less will we have to resist, because we don't have enough of us who are in the right state of mind to actually resist. So think about that. So negative mental outcomes, mental health disorders is something that is supposed to happen when you are under the system of white supremacy, because it is supposed to keep those that are oppressed, or those who are colonized. They're supposed to help to keep them at a subservient level. Makes sense. So Series C is effective in mental change and emotional disturbance. So this is after indiscriminate as a so-called precautionary measure. So here we refer to the brutal methods used to get the victim to speak rather than actual. The principle according to which above a certain limit, the suffering becomes unbearable. Here takes on a particular significance. The aim, therefore, is to attention to details. Excuse me. The aim, therefore, is to reach this limit as quickly as possible. There is no meticulous attention to details. It is brute force using a variety of methods. Several policemen beat the victim simultaneously. 4 policemen stand around the prisoner in a circle, juggling him with him like a punching ball, while one burns his chest with a cigarette and another hits his soles of his feet with a stick. Some of the methods used in Nigeria seemed to us to be particularly horrifying, as they described to us by the victims. A, water was forced through the mouth, accompanied by an enema of soapy water injected at high pressure. B, a bottle is rammed into the ankle. 2 types of so-called forced immobility. C, the prisoner is forced to his knees, arms pulled to the ground, palms upward, keeping his torso and head straight. He is not allowed to move. A policeman sitting behind the prisoner forces him to remain motionless with blows from billy clubs. D, the prisoner stands facing a wall, arms raised, his hands placed against the wall. Here again, at the slightest move or sign of weakness, he is dealt with a series of blows. We must now point out there are 2 categories of victims. A, those who know something. B, those who know nothing. A, those who know something are seldom seen in the medical centers. We may know for a fact that a particular patriot has been tortured in the French prisons, but we never encounter him as a patient. B, those who know nothing, however, are very, very often come to consult us. We do not mean those Algerians who have been beaten up during a police roundup or spot check. They never come to see us as patients either. We mean those Algerians belonging to no organizations who are arrested and taken to police barracks or interrogation centers to be questioned. Psychiatric symptoms encountered. A, clinical depression, 4 cases. Those are melancholic patients, totally devoid of anxiety, depressed, and most of the time bedridden, who avoid contact and then very suddenly become extremely violent for no apparent reason. B, anorexia nervosa, 5 cases. These patients pose serious problems since their anorexia nervosa is accompanied by a phobia of any physical contact. The nurse who approaches the patient and tries to touch him or take his hand, for example, is vigorously pushed away. Impossible to practice interventions, feeding, or administering medications. C, restlessness. There are 11 cases. These are patients who cannot stay in one place. They insist on being alone and have difficulty accepting confinement with the doctor in his consulting room. 2 feelings frequently emerged in this first batch of victims. First of all, that of injustice. Having been day in and day out for nothing seems to have broken something in these men. One of these martyred victims had a particularly painful experience. After several days of unsuccessful torturing, the policemen came to realize they were dealing with a peace-loving individual who had nothing to do with the FLN networks. In spite of his conviction, a police inspector repeatedly said, "Don't let him go like that. Work him over a bit more so that when he gets out, he'll keep quiet." Secondly, an indifference in any moral argument. For these patients, there is no just cause. A tortured cause is a weak cause. First thing to do is to increase one's power and not oppose the question of the merits of a cause. Power is the only thing that counts. So, violence at the hands of who? The colonizers. They are literally torturing people. Literally torturing people to keep the upper hand. Torturing people to make sure that they have the information that they feel that they need to have. Right? So the experiences of the Algerians are vastly different from the experiences that we have here in Black America. But the parallels and the similarities still remain. White supremacy is still the root of all of this, and white people are the reason that we are fighting ourselves. And white people are the reason why we are being victimized by law enforcement officers, right? Victimized by authorities, victimized by those who's supposed to keep the balance, keep everybody in check, but nobody's keeping them in check, right? So post-traumatic slave syndrome is real because it comes out of actual violent situations, actually traumatic situations. So post-traumatic slave syndrome, we can use that term particularly for us in America, not just say post-traumatic colonization syndrome for those in Africa. But it's all post-traumatic stress disorder. It's all dealing with trauma. It's all dealing with PTSD from the violence and the violent environments. Because some of these people, like me, experience violence by proxy. But myself, like many other Black Americans, we have no idea how it has affected us mentally. We have no idea if something is broken in there. But what about those who we can look at these people and we can see how they operate and we can tell something is broken in there? It's the environments, the violence, the oppression, the poverty, the restlessness, the desolates, the vacant esteem, no hope, no future, just trying to survive. We're at war. We're at war for our humanity. We're at war for our livelihood. We're at war for our dignity. We're at war for our minds, for our spirits, for our souls. And remember, war isn't always physical confrontation. War is fought on many fronts. This is the psychological wars. The psychological wars that is, I would say, a next step or a step in conjunction with the physical warfare. The psychological warfare is in conjunction with the physical warfare, and we've been victimized on both fronts. This is what Franz Fanon is pointing out. So that's the first half of colonial war and mental disorders, because I want to break this up because there are a lot of case studies in this, and I ain't want to just make this boring or something, but I want to chop this up a bit. So we read from page 181 to 2. I read from 181 to 216. So I read from 181 to 216 for this video, and for the next video, it go from 216 to 233. 216 to 233 for the next video. I forgot my number, page number. What am I doing here? What am I doing here? Where's that? I just said the back page number. I'm tripping. Okay, hold on. I'm almost there. I almost found it. All right, here we go. 181 to 216. Pages 181 to 216. So remember, the link to the book is in the description, along with the link to post-traumatic slave syndrome. So you can make sure you have both books and see the link between them. What happened to Africans by colonizers is not that much different than what happened to Black Americans by white supremacists. It's all the same. Global white supremacy is real, and it just has different faces in different places, but it all affects us the same. But we have to realize mentally how we've been broken. And mentally, we've been broken to remain slaves. So if we want to bring ourselves up from slavery, we have to fix what's been broken here and fix what's been broken in here in our hearts. So make sure you like this video, comment, subscribe, share, all those things. Let's keep running these videos, run these views up. Let's get this information out. Let's build. Let's get better. Love you all. Make sure you catch the next video coming up.